Hi, welcome. It is Bonded Book Club Discussion Day. My name is Sam Chapin.
Hi, I'm Brittany Kilpatrick. Thank you for joining us for this month's discussion. We are going to be talking about In Order to Live, a book by Yeonmi Park, and it is a memoir of her life. It is about her harrowing escape from North Korea at the age of 13 with her mother and her father and her sister. And once they had escaped from North Korea, the story really just began when she got to China. And from there, she eventually escaped from China into South Korea. And the entire story is shocking. It is terrifying. It is unbelievable the amount that she endured by the age of 15 years old. Eventually, she made it over to the United States, where she has put the book into memoir form and is now a human rights activist. She travels the world talking about what it was like living in North Korea, urging people to become more aware of the regime there, to not think of North Korea as just kind of this comedic, weird, strange place that we only see in movies. It's very serious and terrible. So, anyways, we're gonna be talking about the book and getting into some of the details today. So before reading this book, Sam, what was your familiarity with North Korea? You've studied a good bit about at least China.
So in
North Korea.
Yeah, in college I was an East Asian studies major, so I had some familiarity. I'd read some books similar to this that weren't necessarily memoir format. They were more like historical type fiction, but still very based in reality. So I had heard some of these stories like hers before, but to hear it in such a personal way from someone who's not a fiction, it's not changed, it's her story, it still sends a shock to your system, I think. Even if you're aware that the things are happening, it feels a lot more personal.
I think I told you I've listened to some interviews with her after reading the book, and one thing that she really urges people, especially Americans, to not think about North Korea as this funny place, because we have all these movies, and there's even like a website I remember, like a Kim Jong-il like Tumblr page that's like him and all of his like strange haircuts and like
just like memeified or
memeified. Yeah, I feel like North Korea has been so like memeified here that we don't think about how terrible it is and how scary it is. And even like recently, there was the college student who just got back from North Korea here, and he just like eventually died. Like all of that, like I feel like has happened at the same time of reading this book, and it has been a reminder to me of how these places, these really totalitarian places where people live, are terrifying and horrible, and it's not just a joke. And then there was even that movie. What was that movie? The Interview?
Yeah, where they said, who was it?
But it was a comedy. It was about a comedy about journalists.
To go assassinate him or something.
Right. Like they made it really funny sounding, and I'm totally guilty of probably engaging with that as opposed to viewing it as a place that has murdered millions of people.
I think it's hard because we don't get access to the people in North Korea. The only image we see are the leaders, right? Because they keep it so locked down. It's easy to only think about North Korea as the leaders that we see or the displays of like all the young kids performing, but you don't actually ever get access to the people that live there, the everyday people.
Yeah, so I thought it's been eye-opening for me to read about what it's like living there and how scary and horrible it is, because you're right, we don't have access to the people. We don't get to hear their voices. Very rarely do we get to.
So kind of on that same line, at the beginning of the book, Yeonmi writes, "I am most grateful for two things: that I was born in North Korea and that I escaped from North Korea. Both of these events shaped me, and I would not trade them for an ordinary and peaceful life." Like, that was shocking. Like, how did you react when you read that?
Shocking when she said that, especially reflecting back on that statement, having read the whole book and having understood what she went through. At the beginning of the book, Yeonmi describes and I had really honestly forgotten about this because I was so young at the time, but in the 90s, there was a horrible famine in North Korea. And even now, I think there are still food shortages there.
Seriously.
Horrible food shortages, horrible famine. Obviously, people are not allowed to think for themselves. She described, her mother and her father both going to prison camps and barely surviving, both being tortured and going through these horrible situations. And so when I think about that, and then she says, I am grateful for having been born in North Korea, it was shocking. And obviously, I think, she's been through so much, it's hard to imagine how her life would be different having not been there. Like this has been had such an impact on who she is as a person.
Yeah.
But I was just really shocked by that statement. Having lived there and escaped.
So the title of the book, In Order to Live, in the epigraph of the book, she has a quote from Joan Didion that says, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." Why do you think, having read the whole book, that she includes this quotation, and how do you think these stories are important to our survival?
I feel like in particular with her, so much of what she talked about living in North Korea was this the regime trying to control what people think and feel about their own lives and how they view certain situations around them. And so survivor stories are really important just for them to process and to move forward. But it's almost even more crucial in a situation like hers because I feel like they all learn to process, bad things were happening to them every day, but they kind of mentally compartmentalized and put them somewhere else and didn't think about it very much, or they weren't allowed to.
I think it was really striking to me. There's a part in the book when a teacher later on in South Korea asks her what her favorite color is. She's like, I don't know, because someone hadn't told her.
Right.
And so I think it kind of plays into what you were talking about, this idea of everything was constructed for them. And then to be able to figure out your own story or to do that, to be able to survive is so crucial.
Right. Because at some point she had to learn to start thinking for herself and having her own opinions, and even learn to be appalled by all of the things that she had been through, the starvation, the brutality. And somehow I think even when she said she first started, and I think this is in the book, maybe this was in an interview I listened to, but when she said she first started talking about her time in North Korea, she did not talk about the time in China.
Yeah.
Because the time in China was too difficult for her to discuss. And so that was when the point where she began getting sex trafficked. And so she couldn't talk about that. And so I think she's in the book, she talks about this, where she says, I had to start talking about that in order for me to process and move forward and understand what happened to me.
So some people have critiqued Park, saying that her story has inconsistencies through different interviews and over time. Keeping in mind what you just said, this sort of slow realization that she has to talk about her story, why do you think, or how do you think that quote or this idea of learning to talk about your story is related to maybe some inconsistencies that people have critiqued her on? And do you think that these critiques are valid?
I feel like a memoir is not necessarily a history book. And it's people's perception of what happened to them, and especially when you've been through so much trauma. I think I don't know how you can just process that in an unbiased manner at all. The amount of trauma that Yeonmi went through by the time she was 15 years old is unfathomable to me.
Yeah.
I feel like at some point you start to bury this and to try not to think about that. I think there is some term for that where you start to repress information, because if you think about it too much, you just can't live your life. And so I imagine having to unearth all of this and begin to process was both necessary, but at the same time, I wonder if she thought very much about a lot of these moments very long, even.
Right.
They're so horrible.
I don't know how you could sit and dwell on so much.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't know how you could sit and dwell on it all the time. So, even if there were inconsistencies, I don't know how you could not repress some of that.
No,
and
I completely
forward,
agree. Like,
right?
and so talk a little bit about why it's important that we read memoirs in addition to history, and what kind of extra value do we get from that maybe you don't get from a history book?
I feel like first-person accounts are super important, especially for women, to hear
Absolutely.
someone's first-person account of what happened to them, to hear their truth, as opposed to someone else's version or interpretation of their truth, especially when it comes to, history. Most history books, at least in the United States, have been written by highly privileged, particularly white men, particularly white people. And so in any situation, if you can get a first person's account of what they actually experienced, that's ideal, I feel like.
Absolutely. And, there's something, we try to remove emotion when we
Right.
do facts or history. You can never completely remove any bias, but it's good, I think, sometimes to bring that back into the picture to fully understand what was going on for the people that lived the history.
And she never claims to be a history professor. She never claims to be a journalist.
I think that's a really good point. This is her story.
This is her truth. This is her story. This is what she remembers as having happened to her. And that, again, I feel like Paige, who was with us in April, could talk a little bit more about how survivors process trauma.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
How they remember trauma better than I could. But I think that there's probably something to how your brain processes things when you've been through a lot of trauma. So actually, speaking of Paige, in April we read Bastard Out of Carolina.
Yes.
Which was a partially true-ish, it was part fiction based on real life story about a woman who was sexually and physically abused, who lived in South Carolina as a young girl. She also grew up very, very poor. What did we learn about hunger and survival in order to live as it relates to Bastard Out of Carolina, and even sexual assault and rape? All of these are themes in both of these books. Like, how do they compare?
Absolutely.
Did they cross over for you?
I think it was really striking in the way that she talked about food in the same way that Bone did. When you're hungry, for both of those girls, both Bone from Bastard Out of Carolina and Yeonmi, it consumes everything.
Yeah.
The idea of hunger, it was permeating all of her thoughts. All she could dream about was bread. All she could think, like, her world was so confined, the less food she had, that she could think beyond or have bigger dreams. And I think you saw that too with Bone. When she was hungry, it was all she could think about was having a meal. They would imagine what it was like if they could, have all these different foods. And I think when you get to that base level of survival, it changes what you're even able to see for yourself as a different outcome for life.
I remember her saying, I would have tried to escape North Korea, which was a crime punishable basically by death.
Yeah.
For a bowl of rice.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what I was willing to do. It was that important that I get out of there and find food. And another thing that I noticed between Bastard Out of Carolina and In Order to Live was that both of them had lost childhoods. They did not have any concept of being a child. They had to act like adults and encounter adult situations at such a young age, and partially because of trauma.
Yeah, they talk both about that empty, cold feeling, that numbness.
Yeah.
At the end of the book, Bastard Out of Carolina, she felt nothing. She was just empty. And Park talks a lot about that. Even when she got to South Korea and she's like, I was finally free, she talked about pinching or cutting herself just to feel, because she was so numb. And this is someone who was 15 years old. She's still a child.
Yeah.
And just like in Bastard Out of Carolina, where I had to remind myself over and over again that the events that were happening to a child.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot that, especially...
You're reading Park and she's making decisions for her mom and trying to figure out how they're going to survive. And she is a child. And I think that was so hard to continue to remind myself of what that looks like or is.
Yeonmi even said in the book, she said, I no longer looked like a child, and everything that was childlike inside of me was gone. She was 13 years old. Just unbelievable. So when Yeonmi and her mother and her family were still living in North Korea specifically, the regime penetrated every part of life. Yeah. It controlled what people consumed. They had meetup groups that had to happen every single week for each neighborhood where people would basically tell on each other and report back. And there was so much accountability within the regime. Why does Yeonmi's mother tell her one day when she's going to school, not have a great day, learn lots, watch your mouth? The birds and the mice can hear you whisper.
I think from her mother's perspective, she really just feared for her child. There is so much, like her mother and her father at some point in the book both ended up in work camps for not being loyal to the regime. And so there was this idea that even a child could say something, and if it was against the regime or against the leaders, it put the child and the entire family at risk. Yeah. And so it was better to not say anything, not even think a bad thought,
than to risk it.
And so it's like you just, with the children say anything. Like I think about kids, and so as an adult, you must be so terrified that your child would say something or repeat something. It's, it was their way of, the government's way of controlling the people, but I think there was also a sense of wanting to protect their own children.
And it wasn't even like the things that they said were necessarily like negative. No. So I remember Yeonmi's mother had heard from a relative that one of the regime leaders, when he died, they had, they believed that the regime leaders were gods and that they controlled the weather and they could read people's minds. And I guess that they had told people that he just kind of evaporated and went to wherever. And a relative came to visit them from China and said, oh no, he died from like this disease. And she accidentally mentioned that to somebody. And then suddenly regime people were coming and questioning her and threatening to haul her off to jail. And it wasn't even like it was something negative necessarily. It was just like, I heard this and accidentally repeated it. There was so much fear that was instilled by the regime and what people said. They had to be so careful, even training their kids, sort of like they train their own kids to be loyal in that way.
It was like really hard to read some of these things. I know.
Scary. It was super scary.
So there's a quote in here, and it said, North Koreans have two stories running through their heads at all times, like trains on parallel tracks. Explain what she meant. And I think this is related sort of to what we were talking about just before.
Yeah, that, they were experiencing one thing, which was terror, horribleness, starvation, poverty, violence, brutality, but they were required to process that in their minds as normal, as ideal, and she described how North Korea taught them that this was the perfect and ideal socialist society, that everything was going just as planned. Yeah. Nothing was wrong. This is how life was supposed to be.
And the leaders were taking great care of you.
Everybody was doing
grateful. Great. Yeah.
Everybody was doing great, even though Yeonmi talked about seeing dead bodies in the streets and, having no access to any amount of reasonable health care and having to, eat bugs for food. Yeah. Nothing
no electricity for months on end.
Right. Nothing about her life was okay. And yet they were all taught to process this as this is the ideal living situation. Horrible.
Yeah. So Yeonmi describes her generation as the Maddog Generation. So why is that different than older generations? So what about her generation differed and really defined them from, say, her parents or older than
Right. So this is where she sort of gets into the history of North Korea, which I found to be really interesting. So North Korea, is a fairly new country in general, but for, the first few decades of its existence, it was propped up by Russia and in part China monetarily. And so people were able to be fed. They lived pretty good lives for the first couple of generations, or first couple of decades. We can say pretty good. There was still a lot of murder that I'm aware of. However, people were at least being fed. Like, they were getting government stipends of food every day. Starvation was less of an issue, and so there wasn't a tremendous black market that operated. By the time that Yeonmi was born, starvation was such a problem. So many people were dying, not even just at the hands of the government, just because they didn't have enough food, that black markets began to thrive. And the government couldn't feed people because, the Soviet Union collapsed and China quit sending money to North Korea. So they were no longer able to feed people. So Yeonmi's father and many, many other people began to work on the black market, importing goods in and out of China, selling them, getting the food their own way. And so she calls it the Maddog Generation, where it's the people who grew up under the black market times of North Korea. They couldn't rely on the government for food and to be taken care of. They had to figure out their own ways to survive.
And I think that's really interesting too, because with that influx of the black market, they were allowed more interaction with outside societies. So they were getting products in and even movies from China that older generations were completely blocked out from the outside world. And her generation, although not in like large amounts, was getting like little nuggets of information of what life might look like or be like outside of Korea. And to have that like going in the back of your mind is that this might not be all that there is.
Like, there could be something better out there. Yeah, totally. So when Yeonmi and her mother escaped to China, almost immediately, she and her mother were sold to human traffickers. But at the same time, she recounts, because she had been starving and she just had a surgery that had been botched. She literally had an open wound. She gets over there. What do you think about, even though this was a terrifying situation, her mother was raped almost instantly upon arriving in China. What did you think listening to her talk about having, a bowl of rice, tasting a strawberry for the first time, having a menstrual pad, and tasting ice cream in the midst of her and her mother experiencing horrible tragedy almost at every turn?
I think this was just another testament of, one, just how deprived they had been, that in the midst of all of this, you can still find a moment of joy because you have had nothing for so long that the taste of a strawberry could even, I don't even think about it. It could be such a huge momentous occasion. Also, you're so hungry. We go back to that idea that we talked about before, that when you're starving, nothing else matters. Right? And so for an instant, she's like, I'm not hungry anymore. You could almost forget about the terror that's happening for a moment just to eat. And I think it shows a sense of like humanity. We're not singular humans, right? Like, horrible things can happen. She talks about later that even in the midst of this, when she was with other women that had been trafficked, they still laughed and cried together, right? They still had connections, like human connections. So I think that she then comes back to and is like, this is horrible and I don't care and I don't want to eat. And she starts starving herself soon after this. But when you've had nothing for so long, I think it's human to find joy in little things, even if the situation is terrible.
I feel like it kind of just goes back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, she couldn't even address a lot of other things because she was still so hungry all the time that's all that she could think about. Even though she was being brutalized in so many ways, she was being fed, and that was her number one priority for so long. Like, that was why she came to China.
It was sort of like, I'll deal with the other stuff
the trauma later, getting some food. This is great. So what ways do Chinese attitudes towards girls result in an unbalanced numbers of men versus women being human trafficked?
So I think China has a very interesting and problematic history of its own, especially when it comes to women and girls. And for a long time, they've had policies in place to murder young girls. It was a one-child policy. Girls were not wanted in homes. They wanted sons. And so China ended up with a very high population of men and not enough women. And I think because of that, it drove up their demand for women in China, and
Right.
which played into this black market human trafficking, sex trafficking
Sexually.
in a horrible way. And there was a demand for it, and which is just horrifying. And then on top of it, it was criminalized. So, and we have this problem in our own country when you're putting women into they're forced into these situations, they're sex workers, and then they are criminalized at the same time. It's impossible for them to get help. And for so many of these women and girls, they were so afraid to go back to North Korea. They were being brutalized. They were being trafficked. They were being sexually abused and raped, and they had no power to stop it.
Yeah. She talked about in the book how because it was criminalized, whenever any North Korean women were captured by the Chinese government, they were immediately sent back to North Korea. And upon being sent back to North Korea, were either killed or sent to torturous camps where they would live out the rest of their lives in dire, unfathomable situations. And so there was really no help for them. Like once they got into that situation, unless, you were able to escape. But even then, like you couldn't just go get a job. She talked about not getting a job. She was pretty stuck.
Even children, like if they were to have a child, that child was completely disregarded by the Chinese government. So they weren't considered citizens. They weren't allowed to go to school. So you really found yourself stuck and at the hands of the people that were trafficking you, that were abusing you. You had no safe out. And I think that just contributes to this thing that they're trying to say, that they're like, oh, it's illegal, but it allows for it to
prey on the most vulnerable and to keep that cycle going because there's really no way for them to get out of it at all.
So Yeonmi describes having complicated feelings for a couple people in the book. One being Hong Wei, who was one of her first traffickers, and later she talks about the missionary pastor. So start with Hong Wei, I think, first, and kind of explain where you think that's
Hong Wei was a human trafficker and a broker. So he initially purchased Yeonmi and her mother, and then eventually sold her mother off a couple different times. He also raped Yeonmi when she was 13 years old for I think probably the entire time that she was with him, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, he called her his, mistress, but...
Right, but she was 13.
Yeah.
He also, though, bought her a lot of really nice things. He physically abused her at certain points, but not at others. And then eventually he helped her to purchase back her mother. And eventually, I guess, let them escape. I can't really recall. So anyway, it's a lot of complicated.
He also helped her dad come.
He helped her dad come and helped to pay for a surgery that her dad had. But at the same time, he was raping her and was physically abusive to Yeonmi. So it was a really mixed bag of emotions for her. I think that a lot of the reason that she had mixed feelings, as she called it, for him was that trauma. When you are so desperate, and for her, she was trying so desperately to get out of China once she got there and get to South Korea, and he was helpful for her at certain points, but he was also traumatizing her. I mean, there were a lot of things that he did to her that I don't know how you can come back from emotionally, especially at such a young age, that I just think that, when you've been through that much trauma, you might have complicated feelings. I have read about
that's happened. We've talked about that. And when we had Paige and she was talking about sexual assault and abuse, that it can often come with very complicated feelings. It's telling someone who's being raped or abused, especially a child, that this is love. And it can be, we're dealing with a 13-year-old for the most part. So it was very, I think, confusing when he's giving you some of your basic needs and also taking from you at the same time.
So then
the other one was the pastor.
Yeah, the pastor. So Yeonmi and her mother get connected with a Christian missionary group that is helping people to escape from specifically China into South Korea. And the prerequisite in order to do that is that they have to come and live with these Christian missionaries and go through a course and a Christian, educational course, and then they get to go to South Korea. All of this is completely illegal. So many of these Christian missionaries were risking their lives. At the same time, at one point, the Christian missionary who was the head of the program almost did not let Yeonmi go because he thought she was immoral, because before she came there, she had a job as a sex phone operator, and he perceived her to be immoral. And so he made her confess her sins to a large group of people and be completely embarrassed and go through this course even longer. And she was horrified and embarrassed. So even though he helped her escape, he also degraded her and
it was very
shamed her.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he, was not respectful of what she had been through as a victim of trauma, and that she also did not consent to do any of this.
No.
She was doing this to survive, not because she wanted to do that. She was a child. She was 13 or 14 at the time. So he was really inconsiderate of that, but at the same time, he risked his life to help her get across the border. So again, she had complicated feelings for this pastor, much like Hong Wei.
Right. It was sort of help, but there were so many strings attached
to it that it was,
Which kind of brings up, what is your reaction or your feelings on Christian missionary work in this type of setting overall?
Right.
And the way she describes it's kind of, there's a you have to give in order to get this very
right.
help.
It's, I find it a little hypocritical that in order for people to access the care and the services that the Christian missionaries are offering, it's not just out of the goodness of their hearts because God would want you to help other people. They have to go through courses and convert, and that all gives me pause. That gives me pause because I feel like, again, you should be doing this if you are doing it out of the goodness of your heart and without strings attached. But it seemed like she encountered so many mission type situations in this process that all had strings attached.
Right, where the good was sort of withheld
if you didn't conform and adapt to whatever their version of what a person should be. At the same time, these Christian missionaries throughout the book were willing to risk their lives for people if they did adapt, if they conformed and if they adapted and if they converted, they would risk their lives for you. But if you didn't, all bets were off.
Right.
Which gives me pause.
Me too.
That's my 2 cents on it.
I also had complicated feelings about them, as did Yeonmi.
Yeah, she did.
So during her journey, so this is when Yeonmi is leaving China and headed to Mongolia and then South Korea. She writes, I also started hating the dictator Kim Jong-il that night. I hadn't thought that much about it before, but now I blamed him for our suffering. I finally allowed myself to think bad thoughts about him, because even if he could read my mind, I was probably going to die out here anyway. What could he do? Kill me again? But even in the face of death, betraying the dear leader was probably the hardest thing I've ever done. Considering everything she went through, what does that mean?
It was amazing that it took her that long. But that goes to show you how, in so many ways, I feel like this word is sort of overutilized, but how brainwashed they were into thinking that the leader was a god and that he was benevolent and giving and good and actually cared about people. I'm amazed that it took her literally until the end of her time in China, after being sex trafficked, after escaping all of the brutality and starvation in North Korea, for her to finally say, fuck you, dude. It took that long. So
right. And when she was truly thinking that this could be the very end, she thought she was facing her death in that moment.
No, it was so bad that she had taken a small razor blade and was ready to slit her own throat open if she got captured by the Chinese government. Like, wow.
Her and her mother had a pact, actually.
Yeah.
That they would not be taken alive, and that's
right. It amazed me that it took that long, but that also shows you is how programmed they had been. Yeah, how programmed and how powerful that programming was, because it had been a lifetime of this. Like, that was all she knew. Yeah. And that's really hard to imagine, is not knowing anything other than living in a totalitarian, terrifying, brutal government situation. Like, that was a pretty eye-opening moment for me. That's how long it took for her to think that.
I totally agree. I thought it was just so stark that, because it's hard when you just imagine. There were so many moments throughout the whole book where you would imagine her feeling that hatred.
Right.
She doesn't, and she's able to like excuse it as other problems. She's able to still like look at the leader and be like, "Dear leader." And the fact that even in this moment and in this quote, she calls him the dear leader, as she's saying for the first time, I no longer, I could have hateful thoughts at him, and she still calls him dear leader.
So when Yeonmi got to China, that was basically just the beginning of the hell that she was in.
Oh, yeah.
It didn't get necessarily that much better. I mean, it got a lot better when she was in South Korea, but it was still a really, really challenging time for her. So she had only had, I think, a couple of years of school by the time she got to South Korea. And any amount of schooling she'd had been highly censored in her childhood in North Korea. How do you think that she was able to overcome her steep learning curve when she arrived in South Korea, and eventually, she made it to pursue a college degree and learn English? Like, how do you think that she was able to mentally overcome all of that?
The whole book is really a testament to just how determined she is as a person. They talk about when she gets to South Korea, she tests in at like a second grade level of education. And in a matter of years, she finds herself graduating high school or her GED, which is just, I think it was like 18 months or 2 years or something.
Yeah.
Remarkable. And it's a testament of just how determined. She had survived so much. She had cheated death in so many ways, whether it was her botched surgery or the freezing desert she had just crossed. And I think it just shows that she was going to persevere no matter what. And it's also kind of a shame because she's clearly an intelligent person and had not had the opportunity for so much of her life. I was just stunned, and it's one of the things I can't comprehend, how you catch up. A lifetime of learning.
She had very little learning when she arrived in South Korea, and they told her, I guess she was in sort of this like course when she first arrived there, like, hey, South Korean schools are really challenging.
Yes.
And I remember this from like high school. Like, they have some of the best, most challenging math curriculums in the world. All these kids are super smart and they're really, really competitive. And so, staring down that amount of competitiveness, she learned 12 years worth of education in a less than 2 year period.
Right.
And she went to college and then was the top of her class for the years that she was in college in South Korea. And I think, to my understanding, the beginning of the book said that she's a student at Columbia University in New York City. So
it like blew my mind. I mean, truly. And it's not like they were giving her any passes in South Korea.
No.
She was put up against roadblock after roadblock of them telling her, you don't belong here. Just be happy you're alive, and like, that's good enough. And
that's fresh, but you're not going to probably make it here.
It's not like they offered her a lot of resources to catch up.
No. She had
to fight for that herself.
She did. So even when she got to South Korea, she had to keep fighting and studying and working harder than everybody else 10 times over. Just wow. So you and I have discussed the importance of language and the words that we use and how the words we use matter. Throughout the book, Yeonmi makes reference to the fact that in North Korea there are many things, including romantic love, that do not have words. They had no descriptor for that. or even an understanding of it, really. In what ways did the introduction of a more robust vocabulary help Yeonmi to gain a deeper understanding of her own experience once she started reading when she got to South Korea?
So I think this goes back to when we talked about her being able to tell her story. So Yeonmi describes the more she learns, the more words she learns, she starts to understand her own experience. She didn't know that you could love anyone other than the dear leader. She didn't know that you could love your mother different than you love a husband, different than you love a pet or plants. And so the more she learned, and she read books furiously. She talks about like locking herself inside. She read over 100 books a year, which is like, you and I are working on
like one
a month.
Fine.
And she said, the more she read, she could find parts that related to her own experience. And for the first time, she felt deep feelings. She said for so much of her life, it had always been sort of this shallow surface because she didn't even have, she said, without words, without language, you can't truly feel emotions, which I thought was so powerful to hear her kind of express that.
Yeah. So this one interview that I listened to her give, she talked about reading Animal Farm. And so
yes.
She found Animal Farm off of a bookshelf somewhere and thought it would be a short read about animals, literally about animals. And it was short looking. And so she thought, okay, I think that I can read this book. And so she read it. And she said she began in reading Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm, to understand North Korea in the context of another book. She said She saw her whole life in that book, and then she read it 5 more times.
I remember in the book, she talked about how for the first time it allowed her to release some of that experience.
Yes.
And it took some of the power away from what had happened to her because she could understand it in this different context.
Yeah. And hearing somebody else's version of the story that's so similar to yours is just...
Absolutely. So after burning out in college, so she had a very hard time at one point in her college career. She decides to take a break and go volunteer. And she does this as part of a mission trip and ends up in Texas, which is her first time in North Korea. So when she arrives, touching down in Texas at the airport, kind of describe a little bit of that fear that she was feeling in that moment and what you thought.
In North Korea, everything that she learned was sort of in the context of how to hate America. She talked about learning math problems that said, if you have 4 American bastards and you kill one, how many do you have left? Everything, she learned to hate America. Everything was about that when she was growing up. And so she was terrified of Americans. She didn't even know what they looked like. She had seen these sort of caricatured cartoons of what Americans look like, and they were sort of grotesque and terrifying. And so she, even though she had been learning in South Korea and beginning to understand the world around her, and that maybe perhaps not all Americans were how she had learned in North Korea, she talked about being on the plane and about the moments before touching down and how terrified she was, even though she knew this is not real, but it's the only thing I've ever known. And so this was her first experience seeing it for herself. Life wasn't like that necessarily in other places. So she talked about the plane touching down and all of her fear, and then being in the airport and just seeing people being normal. Seeing families hugging and kissing and people just on their way, going to work, grabbing some food, just it being completely normal life, and how that was just sort of a release for her because she had only ever known that.
Had a lifetime of thinking it was going to be terrifying.
Terrifying being here, which I feel it's so brave of her to even be willing to do that all by herself, by the way. And she wasn't even fluent in English when she came over here. So having that initial fear and then also not being able to speak the language and still being willing to come here and have this new experience was really brave of her, I think.
So during that same trip, she went to Walmart for the first time. And I found this to be just sort of a lighthearted but also kind of eye-opening moment. And talk to us a little bit about what it was like for her when she shows up at Walmart.
She thought that Walmart was the coolest thing ever. Which I guess when it is, she had never seen so many options ever in North Korea. Not even in South Korea, where you can go and get like 15 different types, probably not 200 different types of cereal. Right. Every food, every clothing choice, every shoe choice has a million different options. You don't have to pick whatever. You don't just get what you get. You don't have to, there are just options and options and options. And she talked about buying like all these different types of cereals and oatmeals and tennis shoes and and how that was a really exciting moment for her being in the United States, was going to Walmart, which, I mean, I can imagine.
Yeah. When you've had nothing and you walk into a place that's so overwhelmed with excess, yeah. I think it seems... Yeah. So on the same vein, she travels and volunteers at a homeless organization in the United States. And I thought this was an interesting moment of perspective. And she describes it as like where they were staying as something so nice. And, how did you feel about that? Listening to her talk about someone who's homeless.
It was an interesting perspective. She talked about how she initially done mission work in like Texas, mm-hmm. and then a little bit, I think, did she say she went down to South America for a short period?
Yep, there was, America, yeah.
And then came back to the United States and was over in sort of the Atlanta metropolis area, volunteering at a homeless shelter. And she described thinking it was so nice, this homeless shelter, and the living situations that people were in, how wonderful it was. And this was a homeless shelter. Right. And so that was a little shocking to me, because typically you don't think of homeless shelters as being the nicest of places to live. It's a last resort for many people, or their only option. And so for her to see it as so nice, that she had never seen a place so nice where people would stay. I mean, even coming from South Korea, where she's living a somewhat more normalized, whatever that really means, life, that was a little bit shocking to me. Her living conditions have always been pretty destitute, is what it sounded like, even in South Korea.
I think for me, we're obviously coming from an American perspective. This is where we've grown up and lived. I thought it was a way to really hammer home just how different and unfathomable her experience had been from anything I could even imagine or have ever seen. Because I know what a homeless shelter looks like. I've volunteered in them. You know what I mean? It was like a way here in the United States.
Yeah.
And to say, okay, for me, it was like helping me measure what had happened to her in a way that I could actually tangibly see and know in my own experience, right? So I've seen that and I know what that is, and for her was like, wow, this is amazing, helped me to again really try and understand where she was coming from.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it wasn't like a situation where I think like, oh, we should all be more grateful.
No.
More of a, how bad things can get.
Right. It just helped me like remember where she was coming from in a way that I could sort of put some markers on. Measure.
Yeah, it was a marker of like how bad her life had really been before that.
I think we sort of talked a little bit, like looking at it from our perspective as Americans, and from a very, even for both of us, coming from very privileged situations, were there any moments that really stood out to you
as particularly shocking?
Or even just helped you to understand her experience? Was there anything that she said to you that like really made you like stop and think throughout the book?
There were lots of those moments. I feel like one of the most shocking moments for me in the book was her botched surgery. That was shocking to me. And it was also sort of an indicator of how, and I'll describe it, but like it was an indicator to me of how even intellectuals were not valued in North Korea. So they had sort of a class system that was set up in North Korea such that being a doctor or being an intellectual or being a professor was not necessarily beneficial. It was better than some situations, but it really wasn't. They don't have a great, healthcare system there, and it wasn't accessible. It wasn't really affordable. Everything she talked about, even having to utilize the black market to get her drugs. So at one point, Yeonmi contracted, it sounded like some kind of stomach virus that, and she was already so thin and frail that her mother got so worried she took her to some doctors. They decided that she had appendicitis and her appendix needed to come out immediately. So in order to facilitate that, her mother had to go scrummage up money to pay for the surgery because, the government could not provide that for her. And she also had to acquire the drugs on the black market for her anesthesia. That alone
You woke up.
was shocking for me. So then once they get her open in a really dirty, gross hospital, by the way, they realize, it's not her appendix. She just has inflamed intestines because she's had stomach virus for the last week. So midway through the surgery, she wakes up because her mom didn't get her enough anesthesia because her mom's not a doctor, and why would she know how much anesthesia medication she would need? So they have to pin her down while they finish the surgery while she's awake, which was so shocking to me. Then while she's in the hospital, because her parents couldn't afford to pay the nurses to take care of her, they had to take care of her, and she was literally on the floor of a hospital, and there were so many people dying in the hospital that she described this courtyard outside where they just piled up the bodies and the rats ate them eyeballs first.
Yeah.
That whole thing, I was utterly shocked by that. That was shocking. And of course, when you have a, impoverished situation and a terrifying government, I guess these things are to be expected, but it shocked me reading that. I was like, my jaw was on the floor.
Yeah.
And obviously these doctors are not getting the training they need, because how would you diagnose somebody who has a stomach virus with appendicitis incorrectly?
The schools were teaching math by counting American bastards. So
right. I was like, I remember reading that to my husband, and I'm like, I don't know that I would trust anybody over there to cut me open. Oh my God. Just that alone, having the faith, giving somebody that amount of faith to slice you open who didn't know what they were doing. And then she, in the same week, she had to escape to China. All in the same week.
Yeah.
Just that. That was one of the most shocking situations in the book that I remember. And it helped me to understand what she, the terror that she was trying to escape from.
There was this moment, and I think it's sort of in the beginning of the book when she's still in North Korea, and I forget exactly where her parents went. Maybe her dad was in prison or mom, something happened. And she went to go live on this farm. I think it was with one of her grandmothers or aunt or something.
Yeah, aunt. I hear her aunt, yeah.
And she talks about it as it was, honestly, it sounds like one of the happiest moments in the entire book. She just...
Oh, yeah.
She was so happy. She talks about it as this paradise, and it was simple. She didn't have much, but she had enough to eat. It was before she had to go through the horrors that she went through in China, before her escape. And it was just this very, sincere moment, especially looking back on it, of, her humanity and just how innocent and young this girl was. And all she really wanted was peace and to not be hungry, right? And so I think for me, that is just this moment that I kept thinking about throughout the whole book, is that she was just trying to find a place where she could survive in peace, right?
Yeah.
And to have that where it didn't take much to make her happy. And so I think when we do get separated from the people of North Korea so often in the reports that we get because the country is so blocked off, I think that was sort of this moment of just the humanity of what these people that are going through such horrible things are. I thought that was such a powerful moment for me.
Mm-hmm. So one thought that came up for me, and I've discussed this with you, in hearing about sort of the pretty short history of the country of North Korea, the recent history, is the idea that things don't necessarily just get better. So one thing that's pushed, especially in like the social activism community, is that things are always going to get better, that things are going to keep progressing, that people are not going to go back in the closet once they're out, that things can only get better, that we always just put one foot in front of the other and then life is just going to keep getting better. And so this book and her story reminded me that things can be snatched away from you. Progress can be snatched away from you very quickly.
Yeah.
Did you have that thought at all?
Oh yeah. I think, especially
know about the history of North
it was
Korea.
just that moment of that this country, there was not always a North and South Korea. They were one country, and you can look at South Korea and where that nation is and know that it was just a small portion of history that separated the two of them from having a very cohesive and similar existence.
Yeah.
Right? Just a small moment in history, which is a whole confluence of different events and world events, changed an entire nation for these people. They are culturally one people, Koreans, before the artificial split of North and South Korea, and to have two incredibly different worlds.
Right, just based on where some people were born. Some people
and politics and war that happened changed an entire nation of people. And not in any type of like, oh, it's just like a little different culturally. Like, these people are starving, they're dying, they're brainwashed.
They're brutalized. Oh my!
And the prison camps and just the way that people are surviving there. And it was just this very tiny moment in history. Eastern Asia has been civilized societies for so long, some of the oldest societies in the world.
Yes,
and to think that this tiny, tiny fraction of history has changed everything for the people that are living there is a moment that you can't ever stop being vigilant with what's happening.
Right, because I think that she said that, Korea had been around for like 4,000 years. Don't quote me on that, though.
Close, yeah.
Okay, about 4,000 years as a, unified country. And, the United States, we've only been around for a handful of hundreds of years. Like, when you think about it in that context of time, all I've ever known is North Korea in my lifetime. But for thousands of years, it existed as a unified country. And it's only been in, modern years that they've had this, terrifying split. And I've always sort of had this idea that, modern life is all people are progressing, we're getting more liberal, we're da-di-da, things are getting better. But it was, I don't know, this book has been a reminder to me that, like you said, we have to be super vigilant about protecting ourselves. And even then, sometimes there's nothing you can even do. Like, none of these people brought North Korea on themselves. It was complicated and short moments in history that changed the course of their lives. And it was only over the course of a few decades that it happened. I mean, that's the part that's really hard for me to wrap my brain around, that it didn't take very long at all for it to happen, for North Korea to come into existence at all.
Right.
Just terrifying.
I agree. There are so many moments of this book, and even if you've, read any other, like, history or historical fiction on what's going on in North Korea, you leave at the end just being like,
ah. Yes. Yeah. My mind was blown by this book. It was a very interesting book. I would highly, highly recommend it.
Oh yeah. Super powerful.
Yeah. And she, if you find her to be interesting, she does all kinds of interviews and talks. She's done a number of
there's a bunch of articles she's done too.
High-profile interviews, and now she's living in the United States, so she travels around and talks about this stuff for the UN on behalf of a bunch of other great organizations. But it's a really good book. I would highly recommend it.
Me
Sam
too.
would too.
Next month we're doing something a little
lighter. A little lighter next month.
We're doing some fiction.
Doing some fiction.
A little summer read, because we've been heavy the last couple months.
We have. We've had some heavy reads the last couple months. We're going to go into some lighter beach reading for July.
So if this has been a lot for you, please don't dip out on us. Come back for the next month.
Oh, all right.
This was wonderful, and I hope you guys enjoyed seeing both of us. Let us know what you think. We decided to do this one together. It's a new format.
Sam got a new computer, so we're trying it out. Upgrading our technology.
There we go. All right, everyone. Bye.